Yeah. That session was full of insights and valuable takeaways, and we're just really happy by all this. So now let's shift gears. In today's business environment, change is consistent, and uncertainty is something every organization has to navigate. And real advantage lies on how you respond, how you identify opportunities, adapt quickly, and keep moving forward even when the path isn't clear. Our keynote speaker, or our next keynote, is unlocking growth in uncertain times and brings that perspective to focus. Dr. Kathryn Ritchie, founder of Ignition Institute, will share some practical strategies for scaling ventures to sustainability, strength and resilience, and overcoming hidden avenues for progress. Please make it nice and loud for Dr. Ritchie.
Good morning, and thank you very much for joining me. I'm delighted to be here. What I'd like you to do is to think back to a time when you felt truly aligned with your team, not agreed, but aligned, where everyone was moving in the same direction, where the cadence, the rhythm, the pace was the same, and where you were doing it for the same reason. How long did that last? How far did you get that penetrate through your organization? When did it stop or slow? That gap between alignment and when it slipped away is the gap that I've spent close to the last 30 years working in. And over the next 25 or so minutes, what I'd like to do is explore and share with you some of the things, and I'd like to challenge you as to what you might be able to do to put more money, more growth, more value back on your business table. So during that time of working with leaders, and I've worked with hundreds of leaders and entrepreneurs over the past few decades, what equally has emerged are three foundational truths that relate to growth, relate to performance in business, and are even more crucial during uncertain times. And whether it be a pandemic or politics or geopolitics or wars, explosive, expansive technologies, we've got them all coming at us. And it doesn't look like anything is going to change soon. We as leaders need to step in and face this space. And it's not all bad news because, interestingly, when we are in those moments of uncertainty, when we are unsure, our neurology, our brain is absolutely at its most powerful. It's most optimal in that time. So, really using your brain um, in that moment, and we prefer certainty. Breakthrough thinking, new ways of thinking can emerge. So those three truths. The first, and I'd really like you to think through these and challenge the way you think about your business. The first is strategy only lives if it shapes decisions and behaviors every day. Second, without an aligned performance operating system, your strategy cannot be executed optimally. And third, execution lives or dies in the middle ground. So, where I'd like to start is what is strategy and what is execution? And you might sit there and go, well, that's self evident. Why is she asking that? Well, let me explain why. And we've had examples of it over the past day or so. Is that when founders begin a business, they're incredibly instinctive when it comes to strategy and execution. They don't do lots of documents and preparations. They put a stake in the ground and they iterate and they learn and they tighten and they get a successful model working. And so the strategy and the execution sits within them. It's instinctive to the founder. And it's actually quite similar for CEOs that I've observed come in after the founder has left the organization to take that next curve of growth. They too can be very instinctive. So it's not surprising that there's a little confusion about strategy through the organization. So strategy gets confused with goals and initiatives and activity. And misalignment will ensue absolutely from there. And you might be sitting there and going, well, hang on, have I even got a strategy? Well, yes, if you're making money, if your business is making money, it's a great thing about strategy, it just bears itself out. Then you've got some part of your target market who are buying you over your competitors. So you have a strategy there. And if you've actually managed to create margin and scale over time, then you've probably got a pretty good strategy there. It doesn't mean it's optimized though. And even with the word strategy, it's just used as a plug in so many conversations and so many documents. Oh, we need a strategy there. Yep, strategy there, strategy here. It's overused, misused, and used in a very generalized way. So what we've done and what I like to do is talk about competitive strategy. And so what do we mean here? That's where you put a stake in the ground and position yourselves to win. And then you actually show up on the field to win, not just to be there. That's competitive strategy, and it answers 3 questions. The first is, what's your offer? The second is, who are we taking that to? And the third is, how do we distinguish ourselves? And then if we take that a little further, we can only compete, if we go back to the grandfather of strategy in business, Michael Porter, in two ways. You can either be the lowest cost producer, and there can only be one of those in your space, or you can differentiate. So the reality is most of us differentiate, and even the sharp lowest cost producers use some of that margin to start building out their differentiation, because there's no guarantee that they can hold that mantle. And so if we think about differentiation, we can truly only differentiate at that macro level, at the meta level, in 3 different ways. One is product leadership. We give something to the market that we believe they need. This is a good example of that. Who knew that we needed this personalized device that integrated everything until we were given it? And we can only get a couple of colors and a couple of sizes. The product leader tells us what we want. They're driven by innovation, R&D, and so forth. The second way is customer centricity, where you really understand the need of your customer, the responsiveness that they're looking for, and you lock in behind that. A lot of mid-market businesses, I find, start that way because they see an opportunity and they lock in behind that need and they tighten and they refine. And you can take the core and you can then tailor it and make it relevant and so forth, but you're led by the market. And the third way is operational excellence. That's all about efficiency and consistency and cost advantage. So those are things like IKEA and Costco, where they have a much narrower product range and they're really about value. And the service is much more oriented to a self-serve kind of model. Now, the trick here is you have to be disciplined enough to choose one that has primacy. Of course, you have to invest in all. But if you don't choose one to put a stake in the ground behind, then it's extremely hard to distinguish yourselves in the marketplace and communicate to customers how they're going to receive the value from you. And so if you don't get very clear about your competitive strategy, you will, right at the get-go, end up with a strategy disconnect through your organization. Your performance will be inconsistent, your growth will slow, even if there are opportunities there, and your execution will be fragmented and misalignment will ensue. And so the critical thing here is when you're clear on your strategy, start to build a system that will actually support that strategy. And that will be, so understand the system, and we'll get a system in play where you understand the system at the core, and then you start to align behind that system, and then you'll start to learn. Now, in this, you need systems thinking. You've got to be able to connect all of the patterns and all of the interrelationships, the interdependencies, and that will set you up to get an amplified impact. So it's not linear, which is the power of a system. And you want rolling diagnosis. You want to be pattern reading. What's working, what isn't? What do I need to learn? What are those feedback loops that we need to be listening to? Plug back in and adapt our thinking. And so what we're doing here is establishing a strategy flywheel in our business that serves us well. And at the core of this flywheel is learning. And I'm going to identify 2 learning ways of learning in an organization, and this is most pertinent in times of uncertainty and substantial change. So the first way is when we learn inside our system, because every organization is a system. We don't change the assumptions, we just do it better and faster. Single loop learning. And it's important in certain circumstances. However, and this is where we find ourselves today, if there's a significant amount of change from external forces and or internal forces, then we need to step back and hang on, are those assumptions still relevant? Or are they going to take us off course, break that market fit? And so that's double loop learning, and I can't stress how important it is in this day and age. And it's not that you flip-flop around. You've got to go in, and these are not decisions you make lightly. And as leaders, we've got to learn to toggle between each of those ways of learning. So clarity is absolutely king. And as I began this work several decades ago, I realized that if you didn't start with enough clarity, you'd go nowhere. And then as I started to observe what was going on in organizations, and the work that we've done is very much in the trenches with leaders, is we started to realize, no, there are actually three enoughs. You've got to have enough clarity, you've got to have enough cohesion, and enough discipline. And only when you have enough clarity and enough cohesion does it make sense to start to employ all those disciplines we know. And clarity can be at the highest order. It can be at the level of strategy. It can be at the level of I'm implementing a project or an HR system or whatever. But you've got to be clear enough, and you've got to draw those links back, compete, and position to win. Otherwise, it won't make sense. And then you've got to bring the human elements in, the roles of leaders, how teams will actually optimize all the way through your organization, and the role of culture. And only when you have enough of those can we start doing project management and planning and measuring and all the toolkit that we tend to rush to first without being clear enough about the other two. And I actually quite deliberately use the word enough, not least of all because we have to, as we heard earlier, bootstrap from time to time. You only need enough. Otherwise, you're over-investing. And very often when you over-invest, you also steal the learning opportunity because you need a little bit of dissonance. You need a little bit of a gap, a delta, to force us to think differently and to close that gap. So we truly use the word enough. And this now we use as a very simple diagnostic. So I'd urge you, if you're sitting there going, hang on, this isn't going the way I'd thought, then think about where you need to pay attention, because these dynamics are in play all the time. It's not, oh, check, I've got that done. No, it's a rolling dynamic that you want to keep thinking about as you're looking at what you're doing. So now I want to move on to looking at the performance operating system. Again, we want to look right in behind our competitive strategy. And when I look at execution, it's not a problem of activity, it's a problem of the system. And again, I want you to think back to when you learned to ride a bicycle. You can't just stand there still and say you're riding. In fact, you'll probably fall over. If you think about actually what needs to come into play to be successful, you've got to get your tires all sorted, your balance, your pedals going, your direction. And the most critical thing is you actually have to have motion. The power is only unlocked when you have motion. And I would argue that strategy is a whole lot more like learning to ride a bike than what you might read about in a dry management text. And so organizations are all systems. They shape the way we make decisions and choices. They shape our prioritization. They shape our resource allocation. They shape how leaders behave. And much more. The catch here is that when we live in the system, as we do as founders and business leaders, we can't see the system or diagnose it. We can feel it, but we're not great at being able to identify what are the forces that are really working for us. What are the forces that are there blocking us? What are the opportunities that we can't see? And so you need to find a way to step out of your own system. And as I talk about it, you want to look at your business through a window and see what are the patterns at play and where you might want to pay attention. An example I'd like to use to really show where alignment is perhaps at its very best, certainly in my experience, is in the early growth company phase. The founders put their idea out into the marketplace and they've started to learn, tighten, strengthen that dynamic, and they've got a real flywheel going and it's working. Strategy and execution are instinctive, decisions are fast, formal, and these leaders actually do know what's best for their business for the most part. And they attract people. There were comments earlier today that people want to be a part of that winning experience. And so they take their guidance from the founders. And this works until you want to really drive substantial growth and scale. Because the hidden risk here is that it's very hard, if not impossible, to scale instinct and intuition without transitioning it out of the head and into something that you can build a thoughtful plan that will let you scale. And so in terms of the system, we need to be constantly honing and building that system. And we want to make sure that it shapes the direction in the way we need to go, because what we're doing is building capability into the organization. If your system is misaligned, you're going to get lower performance and you'll miss opportunities. If it's clear and intentional, you will be able to unlock enormous power. Remember, you will get what your system delivers, which, unless it's aligned with your strategy, may not be what you could get or you actually want to get. So now I'd like to move to the final piece, which is the middle ground. So this was a term that we coined a few years ago because we could see that things would get off and running and then suddenly execution would slow. So I started to do some research, and for the last now, actually it's probably over 2 decades, the likes of Harvard, McKinsey and so forth, suggest that some 70% of projects and initiatives fail or are suboptimal in their execution. And when you just think about what strategy execution is, it's just a whole bunch. It's the summation of projects and initiatives that are underway. Now, in terms of that, that's an enormous cost to the business environment. And what we could see was actually organizations are pretty good at, inconsistently good, or getting better at least, at doing the high order thinking, the strategy, the mission, vision, and so forth. A lot of people, and we're going to get stuff done. So we've got high order and the doing, but we've got a great gap in the middle. And that's why, with not enough connection between the two. And that's when we thought about the middle ground. Because in the middle ground, that's where the strategy connects with the plan, connects with the people. And unless there's enough of the competitive teeth, then you're not going to be able to make the trade-off decisions that are essential in that part of the system. And so execution happens person by person, leader by leader, decision by decision. And you want to be able to shape those decisions in the right way. So in that middle ground, you need to build out a middle ground plan, which takes account of the overarching, pulls it down into some strategic priorities, strategic pillars. Most organizations get there. But the next piece is, in the context of your longer range vision, let's say a 3 to 5 year horizon, and now come back to a 1 year that you're going to build your agile iterative plan into. You have to think about what are those initiatives that are going to move you along that course. Because only when you get into that level of detail, not micro, but in that middle altitude, will you be able to make decisions as to this is better than that, we'll do this first, we'll pause that. That's absolutely crucial. And until you get that middle ground plan, you can't get measures that are sensitive enough to give you that forward view. Once you get to the EBITDA and the revenue, you're done. But you want to get a forward view so that you can adjust along the way. Equally, you can't have the right conversations to govern your execution unless you've got a well thought through middle ground plan. And it is at that point that you can start to consider things like culture, Every single thing goes through the portal of culture. Culture outcome. It gives us signs as to what's expected here, what's tolerated, what isn't, what do I need to do to be successful. We've got to make sure that that's wholly aligned with our strategy, our competitive strategy. If it isn't, it'll make your life a whole lot more difficult. And interestingly, very few organizations measure culture. And I would say in my career, the silliest conversations I've had have been around culture because they are loose and subjective. So you need to measure your cultures objectively, and you can. They've got to have a longitudinal data. There are not many measures, but there are certainly some measures to give you an objective read on your culture because it is the best predictor of future performance. We do lots of engagement assessment. That measures individuals. It doesn't measure the system. It measures the sentiment of the individuals in the here and now. Not sufficient. And finally, in the middle ground, we need to think about change. Change a little bit like money. We all have a relationship with us. Some of us love it and create it when we haven't got enough, and others prefer not. And we as leaders have to step in and help our people work with change. And the only way that's going to start is if the change is linked back to the reason for it, which is your competitive strategy. That's your strategic change agenda. If they become disconnected, then it's change for change's sake. And then we start to get resistance. Now, I don't mind because resistance tells us that we haven't fully communicated what we needed to bring people online. And the last comment I'd like to make around change is change fatigue is brought up a lot in what we're saying. I would say change the conversation. Stop talking about the change and start talking about where you're going, what outcomes you're driving, what impact. And if people understand how they fit into that and why you're going there and how they can be successful, they'll want to be a part of it. So in summary, you need to be really clear about your strategy because it becomes an incredibly stabilizing force through times of uncertainty, both in the external marketplace and particularly internally. It allows people to have a sense of security that we're going in this direction. If you're sailing people, the keel is keeping us there, the rudder's helping us get through the rocky waves. But we are staying to course, and that gives me a sense of security. Then we need to align, which is not a communication, it's a behavioral system. And then you need the middle ground that's going to preserve you. And so I began by saying that there are three truths that I'd really like you to take away and challenge yourself as to whether or not you're embracing these. A strategy only exists if it shapes your decisions and behavior every day. An aligned performance operating system, well, without one, you will not be able to execute your strategy optimally. And execution lives or dies in the middle ground. If you can connect your people's head, heart, and hands to where you're going, I can't begin to tell you how much potential you can unleash. So thank you for your time. If you're wanting to read some of the fireside stories, and I say that as me, the storyteller, you, the listener, and you can add your own, please feel free to take one of my books. I'm always happy to jump on the end of a Zoom call and have a chat. Thank you very much.